Welcome to another edition of After Hours. Today, as I mentioned on Sunday, I'm going to talk a little bit about Jesus as Israel. In the temptation stories, when we read about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, there's a lot of things we can unpack in that text, and I couldn't possibly cover them all on a Sunday. But one of the things that we see in the Gospels is how Jesus is Israel. And I don't even mean by that as like, he kind of is like similar to Israel or whatever else, but that Jesus is portrayed as the true Israel, that God's people are summed up in one person, Jesus, the true Israel, and the rest of us are only Israel by being in him. And we see this many ways in the scripture and in the New Testament and specifically in the Gospels, but it comes out in the wilderness temptation story as well, particularly. So there are four different things we can see from this account that point towards this fact. Number one, Jesus is tempted in the wilderness just like Israel. It's important that he went to that spot. That's why the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness. He went to the same place where Israel had its temptation. They went through very many temptations in the wilderness. You can read about them all throughout Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and then they're re-summarized actually in Deuteronomy as they're on the edge of going into the promised land. So they went through many different temptations, and they went through the temptations as well, notice, in the wilderness just after they went through the water. And in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul tells us they were actually baptized in the Red Sea into Moses, and then he likens the cloud of presence being with them to being the baptism of the Spirit. And of course, Jesus had just gone through the Jordan, his baptism in the Jordan. So he's in the water, goes through his baptism, the Spirit comes upon him, and then they go into the wilderness. So just as Israel was baptized, is Paul's language in 1 Corinthians 10, I'm not making that up. He literally references it towards baptism. It's a picture of baptism. So Jesus is baptized, and then they both go into the wilderness. So the gospel writers are wanting us to understand when God's Son goes through the waters and then into the wilderness, you are dealing with Israel, and that's who Jesus is. Number two, as I mentioned on Sunday, both testings last a period of 40. Obviously, Israel spent 40 years and Jesus 40 days, but that's true throughout the number 40 that happens with an individual is always 40 days. It rained 40 days and 40 nights with Noah in the ark. Moses is on the mountain, 40 days fasting when he gets the tablets, and then 40 days when he goes back again. Elijah is there for 40 days as he's traveling towards Horeb. All of these are 40-day trials, tests, temptations that go on. Israel as a nation undergoes 40 years, an entire generation. Obviously, Jesus, the Messiah, is not going to spend 40 years out there doing it, but the link of 40 is a clear reference time. Israel was 40 in the wilderness. Jesus, the true Israel, is 40 days in the wilderness. So there's a link. Thirdly, notice how similar the temptations are. It's not just that they're both in the wilderness and it's both for a period of 40, but rather they are the same temptations. Both were tempted regarding food. So Israel, you remember, time and again kept questioning God. They grumbled against God. God provides manna. It's not good enough. They want quail. They're grumbling about water. It is a constant test for Israel. And Jesus, his first temptation is, will you turn the stones into bread? Satan tries to get Jesus to test God repeatedly out there, which is exactly what Israel had done. Psalm 95 tells us that they tested God. They tried God there in the rebellion in doing that. And so Satan finally tries to get Jesus to worship him, which was exactly what Israel did, both with the golden calf and then the other gods in the wilderness. We're told that they did this, and then when they went in the promised land. So the same three temptations regarding food, regarding whether they would put God to the test, and whether they would worship other gods are the same exact temptations that Jesus goes through. And then finally, Jesus rebukes Satan with scripture, but those scriptures are specifically regarding the wilderness wanderings. So for example, he quotes Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. But in Deuteronomy, that's telling us it was about manna being provided in the wilderness for the wilderness wanderings. He quotes from Deuteronomy 6:16 and also 6:13 and 14 to tell us that Israel's time in the wilderness, he knows specifically he's undergoing the same testing, the same trial they had gone through. So Jesus doesn't pick out of the Psalms or later prophets or out of the book of Genesis. He picks specifically from the wilderness wanderings to do this. They're part of Moses' recounting of the history of Israel and specifically the history of the wilderness. And Jesus does this to say, I know what's going on here. I'm undergoing the same testing, the same trial Israel had done in the Old Testament, but I, the true Israel, I'm going to succeed where Israel failed. So he passes every test. He tells Satan to get behind him. He banishes him. He tells him to be gone, and he trusts the Father, and therefore he is delivered. And so the message here, as we see so many other places, is Jesus is the true Israel. He is the true Son of God, the true King. And this, again, is a point that is made many times in the Gospels. When Jesus is called out of Egypt, Matthew tells us, quoting from Hosea, that this is actually ultimately about the true Israel, Jesus. So Israel in the Old Testament, it's a true history, it's a real people, but they are always a type, a shadow, a pointer forward to the true Israel, who is Jesus Christ. And that is good news for us because, again, where Israel failed, Jesus succeeded. Where Adam failed, Jesus succeeded. Where David and the kings failed, Jesus succeeded. Where the judges failed, Jesus succeeded. Where the priests failed, Jesus succeeded. In every way, every type and shadow in the Old Testament, they find their fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And it's the gospel for us because he has triumphed and he has done it for us. So I hope this is encouraging to you. Hope you have a great week, and I look forward to us coming together this Sunday where we're going to hear from a special speaker to explain some really encouraging underground ministry that Bay Ridge is part of. Come ready to hear and come ready to give as we're going to be taking up a love offering for him. I hope you have a great week. God bless.